I am delighted to be speaking with Ashton Armody. Hi there, Ashton.
Hi, Mark. It's a pleasure to join you.
Hey, we have been communicating a little bit over the last 3 or 4 years, but most particularly quite a lot recently because you've been working on Owen Barfield and have written this tremendous thesis, which I think brings Barfield to life in all sorts of ways. So I was hoping that we could try and unpack some of that as both keen Barfieldians.
Yes, that sounds wonderful. Yes, I'm over at the California Institute of Integral Studies in a really cool program called the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program. And yeah, that's where I was writing the dissertation out of.
Yeah, so look, there's so much in this. As always with Barfield, he has this sort of massive idea and it unfolds in all sorts of ways. But maybe one way into how you were framing Barfield was you use Charles Taylor's understanding of a secular age, which is different from the subtraction thesis of secularism. So this is Charles Taylor's idea that what's actually happening now is not the removal of transcendence or the sense of the divine, the supernatural, but actually is a sort of supernova, is the way that he describes it. All sorts of experiences, experiments, ways of participating or not participating in the world. And it's into this confusing fragmentation that you feel Barfield can speak, has got something to say that helps frame that in some way. Um, could you just begin to say a little bit about that, if I've put it right?
Sure. Yeah. So I read Barfield before I read Charles Taylor. And the first text I read by Charles Taylor was Sources of the Self. And two of my professors did a seminar on that class or on that book. And then they did a secular age like a year or two later. And during that time, I believe I remember the professors mentioning that Charles Taylor had been very influenced by Hegel at a certain point in his career, and so I think I just wanted to footnote that because Barfield, was very influenced by Steiner, and Steiner considered what he was Rudolf Steiner to be in continuity with the German idealists. So I think that that's interesting just to note in the background. But when I read a secular age in particular, um, Charles Taylor, is careful to point out that he's framing the sort of history or the genealogy of secularity for North Atlantic countries or cultures, and he the genealogy that he depicts is very much bound up with Christianity and how at a certain point in the history of North Atlantic cultures there's a kind of buffering brought about, and it wasn't such a bad thing, you could say, um, in the context of early Christianity and all these other religious traditions around where there's a kind of porous experience of self that many of us today sort of bemoan the loss of, but the flip side of that, like the kind of dark side of that, is being susceptible to all kinds of other influences. And so Charles Taylor describes this early process of buffering as one way of looking at it, or one aspect of it was the kind of fortification, moral fortification that a connection to a transcendent divinity gave to people who had faith in one. And then with the notion of the incarnated divinity, that this gives a kind of, I guess, intensification of that, and also a kind of affirmation of ordinary life that wasn't as present, I guess you could say. And this is very much bound up, he thinks, and other scholars think, with even just history itself, like being concerned with history, like with events in and of themselves rather than as they serve some kind of cultural narrative. So anyway, this is like a long description, but I just saw parallels between what Barfield refers to as the evolution of consciousness and how he thinks of Christ being bound up with that, and the way that Charles Taylor was tracing this genealogy in the North Atlantic cultures from this sort of Christian moment up until the secular, the emergence of secularity, which requires this notion of self-responsible individuals, which he thinks couldn't have come about, at least in North Atlantic countries, without the earlier Christian understanding of selfhood and in relationship to the transcendent divinity. And one way of thinking about secularity is that you could say, even, and he doesn't say this explicitly, but I feel like it's implicit, is that it's a potential opportunity to intensify the ongoing revelation that is Christianity, to the extent that there's this situation now where we can coexist with people of many different beliefs, including unbelief or materialism, you could say. And this situation, I don't know, there's a kind of freedom to have a even more, I don't know, genuine embrace without being compelled to embrace Christianity. Anyway, so that's kind of a long, and so that kind of resonates with Barfield's evolution of consciousness narrative in certain ways.
Yeah, maybe I'll, as I understand it, sort of put it similarly, but maybe slightly differently, and hopefully that helps just unpack the idea. But I don't know, if you look at the New Testament cosmology, there's still, it's a transitional cosmology in a way, you might say. There's still echoes of the pre-Christian sense that we live in this sublunary sphere that is under the reign of death, would be a New Testament way of putting it, which means that there's all sorts of influences and forces, entities, some worse, some good, and of course the effects of time itself, transience, and that the Christ event is from above the sublunary sphere, from the high heavens. So kenosis in the New Testament is not fundamentally a moral gesture, but is a cosmological movement where Christ, as the high God, comes into the earthly domain and gives a sort of reference to who we are, particularly as human beings. I mean, you need to argue out what this means for the rest of creation, I guess. But certainly for we human beings, our identification ceases to be within the sublunary sphere with all that turbulence, and as you're saying, the sort of porosity. So a lot of pre-Christian religion is concerned with how you manage moving through that flow and turbulence of other entities and gods and presences and places and so on, through ritual, through libation, through spell, through magic, through sacrifice. And instead, human beings can identify with the one God of the monotheistic emergence, and that gives a transcendent heart to what it becomes to be human. That means that there's a way of rising above, you might even say, using that kind of cosmology of above and below. And so that produces at once a new way of being in the world that isn't so preoccupied with that turbulence, that kind of supernatural turbulence, but does also lead to this buffered notion, the sense of the buffered self, as Charles Taylor puts it. So the porosity declines and the buffered aspect of existence increases. And as you're adding now, that the secular age that we exist in now maybe is the beginnings of a new kind of freedom, so that we can both know ourselves with a sense of security, but that actually leads to a new kind of openness, which is able to reach out to difference and hold that together in a transcendent frame as the many existing within the one transcendent God, that's known both immanently as well as transcendently. But we're in this kind of transition period where sort of fragmentation and chaos and uncertainty is is often the norm, but there is this possibility, as you put it, if we can follow this Christ impulse to embrace the many through a sense of the transcendent one. I think often of it often as sort of a triangulation. Um, it's it's not about unifying, no, so it's not about uniting in a kind of amorphous oneness, but it's about unifying in a rich diversity. I mean, I'm very influenced by William Blake and all this, and I think his sense of how a whole world can be seen in a grain of sand, and the heaven can be seen in the many wild flowers. That's what he's intimating. You might say it's like a a hologram, that in the many fragments is a reflection of the one whole. Now I don't know whether that complicates things further, or whether that feels like it's commensurate with what you were sensing is in Taylor, that Barfield can give a bit more coherence to, even, you might say.
No, I think it's very commensurate. At the end of a secular age, this is, I just think, another thing that resonates with Barfield. Taylor sort of gesturing towards the need to, and he sort of puts it in a kind of somewhat abstract way, but the need to recover other, I don't know if traditions is the right word, but basically what you were describing, like the many, and like he refers to sort of the polytheistic imagination, and how that can, and how, some people might be called to sort of specialize, in the participation, like certain altars, or images of the divinity. And so I think that's one thing that really attracted me to Barfield. When the first text I read was Saving the Appearances, I just felt like he was, because like many Westerners, like I grew up like in a Christian context, but it wasn't really like dogmatic or anything, and it wasn't even really like that lived, aside from the kind of spirit of love and generosity, and but I also like grew up in Arkansas in a Baptist town, and so like I saw a lot of representations of Christianity that I didn't like, and that I didn't feel uh that I belonged or was even welcome in, or at least not consistently, uh and so I just, I felt repelled by it, especially like into my adolescence, and more interested in like the new age, and like more like animistic kind of pagan type traditions, and just wanted to have like immediate experiences of spirits and spiritual realities that were more multiform than just a kind of one abstract god. And I felt like Barfield was really able to present some way of having both of those things, and also why this, it's not really something that we can dispense with, this notion of a transcendent divinity, because at least for, I think, North Atlantic, Western, global North, however you want to put it, like those of us who are constituted with a certain kind of ethical orientation that presupposes a transcendent reference point. And yeah.
No, I mean, I want to come back and ask you a little bit more about that personal element, because I think that a lot of people, when they discover Barfield, it's partly that it touches them personally, and that certainly was the case for me. Partly, as you're intimating there, this sense of the importance of the individual, but not letting that sort of degenerate into a hyper individualism. I think that's one of the things that Barfield can offer. So the sense of being an individual, he argues, comes with the sense that there is a unity in the cosmos. Monotheism makes sense, and that it's the sense that we can say I am as individuals. That's only possible because of the divine I am. And so, but what that does is it means that we can have an individuality that's a reflection not of my sort of sovereign isolated self, but of the divine oneness, and that whereas again as many reflections of the divine oneness, and so it's an open, expansive individuality rather than a closed down, alienated, isolated individualism. And I think that you're right. I think you're right that that's written into the Western perception of what it is to be a self. And maybe that's one of the things that has actually spread much more broadly, and so is a
Yeah.
way in which, as you're intimating, which we'll sort of come back to, how this can move just beyond a kind of, as you say, North Atlantic perspective, somehow trying to colonize the whole rest of the world. Um,
Yeah.
but also, I mean, for me too, it was about this wrestling with Christianity. I mean, I was born in a more liberal tradition, but what did the figure of Jesus mean then? And Barfield's account of how history can have a Christian inflection because of the birth of this sense of what it is to be an individual, was really important to me. It made sense of the figure of Jesus in a way that, I don't know, salvation theories didn't, because I just sort of found them rather abhorrent. The idea that Jesus is necessary because God somehow needs a sacrifice to
Yeah.
atone for the hideousness of our sins so that we can enter the divine presence. That, just, it made God out to be a sort of monster to my mind. And so I wrote my book, A Secret History of Christianity, to sort of wrestle myself with what Jesus could mean. And Barfield, changed my sense of what it is to be Christian completely. And incidentally, just in parenthesis, I was very glad that Charles Taylor, in his latest book, Cosmic Connections, does actually reference my book. So he must be
Oh,
thinking
wow.
himself about Barfield as well.
Wow,
That was
that's
a nice little,
amazing.
yeah, that was a great thing for me. But us just say a little bit more about your own personal encounter with Barfield, because you do talk about this, so you've been open with this, and it may be that it resonates with people as well. So this sense of how can one exist in a world of spirits and a rich ecology, but not be pulled apart by that, not be lost to that. I mean, you had a very tangible experience of that, which you talk about.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. So I went to an ayahuasca retreat in Peru, and it was in the jungle. And I mean, it was an amazing experience. And, many people have had similar experiences. And the jungle was just such a part of it. Just like, I just felt like really decentered in my, and now I feel like I have a more complex understanding of the human. Thanks to Barfield and Steiner, but I felt maybe I was sort of decentered from a shallow anthropocentrism through that experience, and just felt, yeah, I afterwards I felt I just had a new appreciation for the psychic boundaries that we have, the buffering really, and what should I say about it? Just the experience of feeling like there were other agencies in one's mind that I took some kind of like that was ingested. It was something that I didn't consciously, aside from the fact that I chose to imbibe the sacrament or the entheogen or whatever you want to call it, plant medicine. Um, there was something that I had, once I had done that, no control over afterwards. Like I couldn't just make it stop, and there were certain points where I really wanted it to stop. And there were kind of they call, yeah, just like echoes of that in my life for years afterwards. So that resulted in just like a lot sleep issues and just all these issues, and like just feeling like my thoughts had more agency than they actually do, and just a lot of unpleasant after effects of that, but also, like life-changing positive experience, but in the sense that like I felt more existentially, it's kind of like metanoia, like that part in Saving the Appearances where Barfield talks about metanoia. I felt that really spoke to me, and I just had no other option but to really take my inner life seriously and work to transform it. And Barfield, along with Steiner, having this narrative makes that ties buffering to this awakening of self-consciousness, and imagines this future where we can become porous or receptive once more to the I say plurivocal world in my dissertation, uh, but with a kind of control over that, I guess you could say. Like it can be a kind of art, rather than just being blown open and not having any kind of way of finessing how you interface with other intelligences or things like that. So that's kind of a convoluted expression of it, but
Mm.
so
No, I
there's a
mean,
little bit.
I mean, I think for myself, I feel often a bit more skeptical about psychedelics, precisely for the reasons you're explaining. That I've no doubt that it can open people up to all sorts of perceptions of reality, but at what cost? And people obviously talk about integration and setting all that endlessly now. And so part of what
Mhm.
so intrigued me about your work is how the Christ perception of our nature can help with that. And by that I mean that which is part of certainly mystical traditions within Christianity, which is the sort of disidentification with the local self, that in one moment you feel is isolated from the rest of the world, but in the next moment, maybe through ingesting some kind of entheogen, you feel is like just sort of blasted with the rest of the world. And of course, mental health in various forms can take people through often horrible experiences like that. Ego dissolution is not a straightforward business. But if through the mystical practices, which are there's a kind of common thread here, I think that there's the disidentification with the small self, you might say, and then the awareness that we're held within the divine reality, that there is this transcendent, infinite, eternal source or wellspring at the heart of us, which Meister Eckhart would call the uncreated. Mother Julian would talk about as that which holds otherwise vulnerable, finite, hazelnut-like entities in existence. That's very much part of what has emerged in the Christian tradition as the great task, sort of foreshadowed by the notion of this one person, Jesus's incarnation. It's not just something that happened 2,000 years ago, but is the truth of our anthropology too. So that again, is that my way of putting it? Does that resonates with what you're describing in your own experience?
Yes, yes. I think that, as I agree with you, I also, I experienced psychedelics already in high school, and and so they were really positive for the most part at that time, but progressively they've become not so positive in my experience. And I think it was it Ram Dass or one of the the kind of famous psychedelic people said something like, "Once you get the message, hang up the phone," or something like that. But yeah, I think there's a couple reasons maybe why we could say they can be problematic, and one of them I think is that there's not, at least in cultures where psychedelic experiences provide this sort of window into more than the consensus reality allows for, there's likely not traditions of formation that prepare people to encounter themselves, like in all of what there is, that you're unaware of, and that can be kind of traumatizing. Or to like negotiate interfacing with other intelligences, I think that can also be traumatic. But as well, if there is something like an evolution of consciousness, I think someone like Barfield and Steiner, this is, I think, a more complicated question, would be circumspect about using a kind of chemical, like I was sort of touching on earlier, some kind of way in which you are sort of forcing that porosity rather than cultivating something through a kind of willed, intentional, regular, meditation or something, as you were sort of describing. But then, yes, I think that possibility of yielding or surrendering and letting the not I but Christ in me, I think is just, there's just such a freedom in that. I think because part of the torment of the small self is being good, and if you can just let something come through you that is like cosmic love, and that can sort of help you negotiate any situation, what else would you do? What else could you choose? Yeah.
Yeah, look, thank you for that. I mean, in a way, what Barfield might be saying is that um, the return of psychedelics in the modern world, and I say return, because there's already been one sort of renaissance back in the 60s and 70s, but it's it is a sort of meeting of worlds, a polytheistic worldview that's entering now a materialist worldview, and at a sort of metaphysical level, that's a recipe for complication, if not on occasion disaster. But what is so extraordinary is that Barfield is saying there's something that the Christian metaphysic has got that's fundamental here. Um, and maybe just to swing to a sort of third element that you weave into your work, to flag this up. If we've had your engagement with the history of ideas, particularly through Charles Taylor, and then there's this personal element and how we negotiate the sense of ourselves in relation to all that exists around us and within us. There is also a strong strand of reflecting on this social moment, our cultural times as well. And you talk, I think, if I remembered rightly, about we're sort of at a bit of a fork in the road, it feels like. And we've forgotten, if you like, at a cultural, social level, about our relationship to the one God, and instead have tended to devolve that into a sort of immanentism, which may be on the left, if I can, speak in very broad terms, has thinned out our sense of what it is to be human. But maybe in other parts of the political spectrum is trying to make us immanent gods. I'm thinking of transhumanism here, which threatens to, destroy the material world through the consumption of energy and so on. And so this return of Barfield's reflections in relation to what has deepened since he died in the 1990s, that's another key part of what you're trying to bring, I think. How can we understand what's happening socially, culturally, politically through this lens is another wonderful part of what you're at least beginning to suggest. Again, is that you have that in mind as well?
Yes, thank you. Yeah. And it's also connected with a secular age, because one of the concerns that Charles Taylor has is whether or not, you know, like generally speaking, I think it's true of left and right, but I think there's somewhat more of a version of Christianity, generally speaking, on the right that is sort of, you know, right? This idea that Christianity is like an ongoing thing that hasn't been ongoing revelation that hasn't been perfectly realized anywhere, but that the leftist values of universal justice and benevolence that inspire like decolonial activists and all kinds of other social justice oriented endeavors, I think with Barfield and Taylor and other thinkers like them, they point to this genealogy of cultural orientation around a transcendent divinity that makes sense of that, like going beyond the blood and loving your neighbor, and just this concern for also like making the earth more like heaven, in the sense of trying to realize justice through history. Like that is something that we may not be able to maintain consistently without this, what Charles Taylor would call moral source. And I think Barfield is really powerful because, following a kind of Goethean way of looking at evolution, there's this way in which what might seem today, in our context where there's this sort of division between the humanities and the sciences, there's a way of like seeing this Christian narrative also at work in the evolution of the earth itself. And so that's why I find Barfield so compelling, because for a lot of common sense people today who maybe got raised in a Christian household but we are just sort of secular or agnostic, it just seems, sort of like you touched upon in relation to the salvation emphasis, or just the idea of a human, God becoming a human. It just seems so absurd. What would it have to do with natural evolution, and which is common sense for people today? I'm getting
Yeah,
a little sidetracked, but go
yeah.
ahead.
So again, maybe if I sort of just reflect back a little bit, what I
Yeah,
think that you're saying there, and to see whether it makes sense, amplifies it in any way. Um, I mean, just to pick up on one thing, I always get a bit nervous when politics is presented as making Earth a bit more like heaven,
yeah,
because I
yeah,
think
yeah.
that part of the problem there is this flattening of what it is to be human. It's as if we've got to build heaven on Earth, whereas things like justice and so on aren't actually ends in themselves, but are kind of moral guides towards another end, which would be a sort of participation or a harmony. Because the trouble with justice in a flatland, it seems to me, is that you get a sort of build up of rights which are good in
Mhm.
them as individual aims, but inevitably come into some kind of conflict when it's in a sort of immanent frame. And we feel very conscious of that now. And what's lost, you talk about the Goethean idea there, this notion that the end product, if you like, but I think he says that this is a quote you have of his notion of Bildung, the end product and what is in process of production, they've got to coexist. So the particular and the universal, the immanent and the transcendent, have got to be both present to us, and a flatland loses that, and so we try to force heaven into the earthly frame, if you like, and that only leads to conflict, and for all the good that it can bring about as well, and which feels like part of the fork in the road we're in now. I mean, just in terms of that element, does that make sense of what you're saying?
It does, yeah. I hesitated when I said heaven on earth. Yeah, I agree. I think, one thing that I was really struck by, I've mentioned Steiner a couple times, and I think Barfield has this attitude as well. There's a lecture, I think probably Steiner said this multiple places, but he was like, you know, it is misguided uh, to think that we could achieve paradise on earth, and that shouldn't be, we shouldn't, even though we should strive always to try and make the world a better place and act on behalf of the good, we shouldn't have the illusion that we can make this earth a paradise. And um I guess what I meant more, and I think even just, yeah, the idea of justice itself is not, it doesn't go all the way to what the Christian ethic really inspires, which is something that takes you beyond justice in the sense of you get what you deserve, or there's some kind of punishment, but that there's this possibility of forgiveness and like letting go of hurts. And I don't want to tell, and I don't want to be in charge, like, or just encourage people to just bypass feelings or resentment or pain or suffering that's been caused by others, but this connection to something that transcends the immanent power dynamics, I think, is really behind also this universal justice, in the sense that, and beneficence, that we can love all of humanity and wish the good for all, and even though if we can't practically realize it, still try to. And that intuition, I think, is related to this possibility to go beyond finite power dynamics into something like forgiveness, but that's not consistently performed, I guess, among people on the left or liberal societies. And that's kind of part of the problem we're facing now, and why I think the election in the US went the way it did, that the left really needs to, I don't know, like look back at its history and look in the mirror and be more consistent. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, you referenced there loving humanity, and of course that was actually became an explicit debate at one point between JD Vance and Rory Stewart here in the UK, a political commentator. I don't know whether you picked this up on the West
I,
Coast, but
I didn't
there was
know.
this kind of Twitter spat about it, and what it precisely seemed to miss, as far as I could make it out, was this Barfieldian sort of triangulation. You know, Vance was saying, you love your family first, as it were, and Rory Stewart saying, no, the more liberal position, you love humanity. But there is a position, I think, which knows that through the particular comes the universal.
Yes.
And this actually is an old idea. It's in Aristotle, where he talks about in his Politics how you learn about love in the immediacy of your immanent circle, and that becomes a school of love where a different kind of love, maybe it's a sort of compassion or a friendliness, an attitude towards the wider polis that can develop. And that's a transcendent notion of what love can achieve in us. And in fact, I think Aristotle broadly says that justice is actually a failed sort of friendship, that we have to resort to the mechanics of justice, if you like, when the natural participation that might emerge through the school of love in a friendliness towards all, when that breaks down, and we're flawed creatures, it inevitably breaks down at some points. But then the Christian element adds, as you're saying, this notion of forgiveness, which in a way is saying, but we can always start again. That because
Yes.
something has broken down at one point doesn't mean that's the end point. But it can be worked through. I completely agree with what you're saying there as well. There's no bypassing here, because it's a process of learning and expansion and growth into this always present possibility of more, which is we get intimations of here on earth, and we'll find its fulfillment in heaven, which is why this is, an explicitly Christian vision at the end of the day. There's no sidetracking that, I think.
Yeah, yeah, and I see what you mean by triangulation. I think that's great, because part of what goes into genuine friendship, right, and this capacity to forgive, is an awareness, a kind of humility, an awareness of one's own capacity to harm or fail in some moral way, by and but but having, this the forgiveness of the divinity. Like, so how could you hold something over someone else if you're already forgiven yourself? It's not fair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But look, maybe something else that to bring in, which you explore a lot and very helpfully, is the theme of polarity. I think this is another way. I've talked about triangulation, but polarity is very close here.
Mhm.
So maybe if I just give a little intro and then, sort of over to you to unpack further. But this is a notion that you find in Coleridge, and of course, Coleridge is very important to Barfield. But it's the idea that we don't live in a dual world that splits and divides, but we live in a polar world that holds in tension differences together. So there's difference, but without distinction. So, for example, you might say there's not matter and mind, but that matter and mind are poles of an underlying unity, or there's not will and then grace, but that will and
Mm.
grace can cooperate, can participate one in the other, and that the immanent will, if you like, can then become an expression of the divine grace, or the localized matter can become an expression of the universal mind. And you explore this a lot in terms of the tendency to individuate, but then to reunite. And that's one way that you talk about it. Or you talk about how we have a directionally creator tendency within us. Or you also talk about how we have a capacity for what you call separative projection. So I'm throwing a lot of key concepts out there, but maybe you could pick up on one or two of those things and and unpack this notion of polarity, which I think is so fundamental for imagining how we actually are to overcome these divides and these dualisms.
Yes, yes. I think of separative projection as the kind of dynamic symbol for everything. So Coleridge, was the one who put this into English and brought his own innovations, but he was especially also echoing Friedrich Schelling, who was a German idealist. And Schelling had this vision of like cosmic unfolding as being this basically polarity, the sense of polarity as there's the tendency to the centrifugal tendency to fan out like in a kind of sphere, and then to draw in the centripetal tendency, and they're like kind of fluctuating, and but the polarity. So that's the polarity, but for him, the polarity prior to manifesting in cosmic evolution is a unity. And so there's an underlying tensive relationship between the poles that keeps them creatively like reproducing that dynamic, and that that relationship between them constitutes a kind of third. And so Coleridge will say that polarity is actually triunity. and and so there's this tendency to individuate that we see in cosmic becoming, and then the underlying relationship is expressed in this tendency to then reproduce the attachment somehow. And so you could say Barfield sees this, well, Coleridge and Barfield see this at work in creation at large, in the sense that it's non-identically repeating itself, and so building on itself, and like turning in and then turning out and then turning in, and the complexity of life forms, you could say. And in the human, this separative projection, where there's a unity that is dividing itself and complexifying and never repeating in the same way. In the human and in human evolution, there's a kind of falling away from this unity, which Barfield describes this earlier form of human experience where we were bound up with the life of nature as original participation, and this kind of like fall into a buffered experience where we are counterpointing the world of objects as a separate self. And there's this potential, which he refers to as final participation, to reproduce the unity, but without annulling what has been created in the meantime, which is this experience of being an individual, and that's bound up with a kind of new ethical relationship, the I-thou relationship with other human beings and the world itself. And he says even that Barfield has this great essay, or no, it's in What Coleridge Thought, the book he wrote about Coleridge, that the ethic of I-thou depends upon our capacity to enact separative projection psychologically, where I recognize that we are one in the sense that we are both in relation to this divinity, but that we're also separate, and that we can come into a higher unity together through our mutual participation in this divinity. But yes, so that's kind of
Yeah.
writ large separative projection. And polarity is what separative projection, you could say, is the dynamic of polarity when conceived dynamically.
Yeah, I mean, it can sound complicated, but actually, the minute you reflect on even how one speaks, how one has a dialogue, that we're both, as it were, contributing our best, which is an individual, separative, if you like, activity, but in the meeting, is, one hopes, particularly to listeners, but one intuits within oneself as well, the emergence of that which is actually shared in the dialogue. And that's why a dialogue can be so wonderful, because you say more as an individual than you thought you would before, because it's in the exchange that more emerges.
Yeah.
Another sphere, which I think this is a very common experience actually, is that my undergraduate degree was actually in physics, and I keep in contact with my physics tutor, and he's written and spoken about how this common, I think, experience amongst physicists that they're working on their particular project. In his case, dark matter and cosmology, but in that particular project is felt a participation in, he would be happy to say, the mind of God.
Oh,
That the detail is precisely what reveals the whole. And you talk at one point about how a particular problem in maths at once illuminates the tremendous world of maths, if you like, of which the particular problem is just one little aspect. But the whole is always present in the parts. This would be the sort of Goethean impulse in biology as well. And so, this can sound complicated, but it is, I think, an accurate reflection of how we actually experience things, when we're not trying to force our experience through the much less natural, hyper individualized or separative or flatland kind of ideology.
yes, yes, yeah, amen. It can sound abstract, but it is so concrete. And for me, I think in What Coleridge Thought, there's a place where Barfield's describing how Coleridge envisioned this at work in the kingdoms of the natural or the creatures on Earth. But there's also some great books by Goethean researchers and that depict it, like you can see it in animal forms. And so it just, but then as Barfield and as you just touched upon, it also manifests in the kind of psycho-spiritual dynamics of a dialogue, or the individuation process of an individual's lifetime, or yeah, it's everywhere. Yeah.
And there's this bringing together, another way which you touch on, I think, is the bringing together of the sort of empirical with the meaningful, or the event with the unfolding of a deeper mythology. Both Barfield and Steiner, they very much wanted to bring those two aspects together in the way that they related history. Um, it's well known that what precipitated C.S. Lewis's conversion was the realization that a myth had become a history in the story of Christianity. But for Barfield and Steiner, this is actually quite a general principle. And you discuss how what Barfield wants to do is give us an intuition of that happening in history as well as in other aspects of life too, so that we can know ourselves to be part of a flow, but also then coming to participate in the midwifing of that flow as well. We're not just, as it were, eddies being pushed around by the wider stream, but can, through a raising of consciousness of this, an intuitive or an imaginative consciousness of this, become participant sharers in the wider unfolding as well. And you talk about how this is so important because when it comes to, say, ecological concerns, an ecology that at once wants to assert there's a moral imperative in terms of how we relate to the wider world and the environment and our fellow creatures, but at the same time try to rest that on a purely naturalistic understanding of who we are in the created world. And that sort of undermines itself, it hamstrings itself. And because, the naturalism underlines the moralism. Whereas
Mhm.
if you can get this intuition that at once there's the immanent process and the transcendent frame, and then the bringing together of those two aspects makes sense and hangs together. So again, this is a very strong claim, really, that the ecology needs this Christian, or at least transcendent, immanence as well. That's another thing which you touch on, and why this really matters in terms of how we imagine our way through the ecological environmental crises.
Yeah, so the way that I sort of get at this in the dissertation is by bringing Barfield into conversation with thinkers like Bruno Latour and another thinker, Dipesh Chakrabarty. And they're, for them, they envision the era of history that we're entering as the planetary era, and they connect this with the notion of the Anthropocene, where some scholars use this, some scientists use this to refer to our geological epoch as this time where the human species has decisively stamped its influence deep into the earth and is influencing all the processes, and so we've become a kind of, well, planetary force, and now have some kind of responsibility to figure out how to harmoniously participate in evolution without destroying the biosphere. And thinkers like Latour, they point to modernity and modern philosophy and just the whole character of the modern era, at least in the West, where there's this, as they describe, bifurcation of nature and culture, and this notion that human history has some kind of end to it, or that there's a kind of aim for freedom and something that to them seems actually out of continuity within the rest of natural evolution. And so they want to claim that there's this kind of untenable distinction between nature and culture, whereas for Barfield, there's a different way of looking at what modernity means, and considering it as ultimately provisional, this distinction between nature and culture that reflects the more experienced distinction between subject and object and the awakening of self-consciousness. And so, like, following Coleridge and these German idealist thinkers in general, they think of history as part of natural evolution, human history, and these distinctions reflect the awakening of human self-consciousness, and that we can't just, as Latour and others sort of inconsistently suggest, that we need to just figure out, like other species, how to maintain habitability, and we shouldn't be concerned with the human species survival, but just with habitability. And whereas Barfield thinks that the human is part of the earth and an important part of the earth's coming to consciousness of itself, and that this is something that we have to integrate in our ecological concerns with preserving the biosphere, that it shouldn't be misanthropic, is and so that is this awakening of self-consciousness for Barfield is bound up with a relationship to transcendence, and something that the individual can have a relationship with, that pulls us up out of the just totally immanent power dynamics and religions that reflect that kind of I guess magical maneuvering of the turbulence and what have you.
Yeah, so maybe this is a good point to bring in a notion of Charles Taylor again, actually, but this is this notion of the interspace, which has a correlate in Barfield of the imagination, or maybe the in between, and how this third domain again. I say third again because of the threes always keep coming up for me, but this makes for a new possibility. So it's not the bifurcation of nature and culture, which tends to, when you're concerned about habitability, tends to put the emphasis, you might say, on nature, to the detriment of culture. But that if that tension can be held, then there's a third possibility, maybe between the subjective and the objective, a bit like between mind and matter. It's not a pure sort of relativity or mechanism, but the transcendent comes in because it's a working with the mystery of the logos, of the divine word in the many things. And so understanding our role and the expression of the natural world itself to be a manifestation or an incarnating or an expression of the divine life, that we have a part to play in, and that part which we play is by necessity intimately connected to the life of all things as well, to put it on the grandest possible scale. So that it's in that place that you can feel this recovery of a kind of unity that brings all things together and avoids the misanthropy. I mean that's putting it in one way, but maybe for Christians actually, the way that this is more immediately felt is in the sacramental, and you talk about this as well. And so this is the idea that we actually live in two places at once. We live in the finite world, but the finite can contain echoes and reflections of the infinite, which is why in a sacramental tradition in Christianity anyway, the bread can be said to be at once bread and also the body of God. And that this view of things helps to hold imaginatively together that which is manifesting and unfolding and becoming expressed and known in a final participation, to use Barfield's word. Now again, I could sort of let me just check in with you that I haven't gone too off-piste in terms of how you understand it as well before continuing.
No, I think that's beautiful. I mean, I think that just reframes what it means to be doing science, I think, because it's no longer about just getting to know a world without value, but there's a kind of, especially like within this era of crisis, that the value is very clear and that we can become conduits, right, for like this divine creativity, and with a kind of focus on healing the world and valuing it as a sacrament.
Yeah, and Barfield's reflections on language, I think, can help here as well. This is partly echoing to what you were saying earlier about the personal experience and what the thoughts and feelings that pass through our own minds. But when language is seen as a meeting of the microcosm and the macrocosm, or the immanent and the transcendent, because we don't have language in a way, but language has us. But we can nonetheless work with it, a bit like the conductor working with the orchestra, say. And so our personal purposes in our interiority through language can join with the purposes of other selves, of course, but we our language is itself mirrors an expression of the natural world, because language has structure as the natural world does. It has intentionality as the natural world does. It's a festival of communication, as we know, is going on in the natural world. It has meaning expressed in words, but clearly the natural world has its own variety of meanings as well. But because we can use language purposively and self-consciously, we can also know that that is an expression of the structure, intentionality, communication, meaning that is replete throughout the natural world too. And so our speaking becomes, maybe in its highest form, it's a sort of freedom that is an expression of praise. I think this is why praise is such an important part of Christianity, but of course other religious traditions as well. How you're speaking matters not just instrumentally, but matters expressively. And what are you tending towards in the way that you speak? And so, Barfield's not alone in this, in reflecting on the centrality of the Logos in the Christian tradition. But I think he does give it a wonderful freshness, because he has this sense too of evolution, that we're tending towards a final participation, which has this element of self-conscious co-creation at the heart of it too.
Yes, and his whole, whereas with someone like, well, the extension of Goethe's method that researchers after him have taken up, looking at the history of life on Earth and looking at the way in which separative projection, which we could say, it's a kind of a Trinitarian dynamic, and the Logos being sort of like the middle of that. That natural history depicts that in the shape of organisms. That in Barfield's work, he traces that in the history of human consciousness through the history of meaning in language, and he suggests that language has come about as a kind of internalization of the world as a speaking world, and has facilitated, so through that process, it first internalizing the world through memory, and then eventually being able to like redeploy memory images as symbols and communicate with each other, that it's a kind of gift from the world that has facilitated our self-consciousness, but then, gradually has resulted in a situation where we're sort of insulated within a certain materialist or opaque uh, imaginary. Barfield uses this phrase, collective representations that are mediated by our language. But now there's, as you're referring to, with this kind of poetic capacity, uh, to use language creatively to potentially transform the cultural imagination, so that there is a kind of recognition of the world's speaking once more, and a participation, and a renewed participation in it, to the extent that we can, you know, speak in everyday communication, or even just in writing poetry and other works of art that that sort of imbue culture at large with these intuitions. And yeah, I think that's part of what Barfield envisioned final participation as consisting in, among other things. But
You mentioned poetry there, and he writes about how poetry works, and roughly speaking, his idea, I think, is that words aren't just signs, but they carry soul, they carry resonance and participation themselves. And so what the poet does is put words together in such a way that that inner life of words becomes evident to us, and so becomes part of our inner life when we read the poetry. And poetry itself then is revelatory. After you've, I don't know, read Wordsworth's poems on solitude and so on, you see the cloud, you see the daffodil in a new light. It carries a kind of life for you. And so we share in the meaning of nature by bringing our meaningfulness together with it. Again, William Blake was really onto this as well,
yeah.
when he says, that the wise man sees not the same tree as the stupid man does, because we can bring to the surface in our capacities as humans that which is implicit in the world around us, but also add to it. And the direction of travel is towards God, that was the source and wellspring of all things anyway.
Hmm.
Poetry and art in general has this kind of high calling, if you like, in Barfield.
Yeah. I mean, that was partially also what inspired me, because I came to this philosophy program prior. I had been studying film, and I was just, into art, and I was always interested in, higher visions of the artist's vocation. But yes, I love that. What is that line from Blake where he's talking about the sun? He's like, do you not just see it as a coin? And what do you? Yeah, I'm sure you
Yeah,
know it,
yeah.
but
It's a sort of a dialogue he has with a flatlander, and the flatlander says, when you see the sunrise, don't you just see a golden disc about the size of a guinea, a small coin rising in the sky? And Blake replies, "Oh, no, no, no! I see the heavenly host crying, holy, holy, holy." And it's
yeah.
precise that capacity to draw attention to that which is implicit. And I think he's reflecting on the nature of light here, which of course is a great Steiner theme as well, and how
Mhm.
there's a reason why in language we use the word light to describe the light of the sun, but also that which might enlighten our minds, and then also, of course, the divine light, and the many lights being a reflection of that one light. It's not just some sort of strange metaphorical but meaningless coincidence that this word carries us right through all these different dimensions of reality. And what we can strive to do is to make sense of that, to know it in our lives.
Yes. Yeah. Amen. Yeah. Right. Like, we see with our eyes, but also with the imagination, and always, right. And um, yeah, I think what you just touched upon, I think, is related to this sense that we're not just, by kind of intentionally cultivating the imagination, not just interpolating things, but actually having the capacity to perceive more than just with the materialist imagination, where all that is there is what's there for the senses alone. But that light has some kind of Steiner, like translating or translations of Steiner and Barfield will sometimes like use this word moral, but I don't think that's a very good translation. There's a kind of aesthetic or a qualitative, character that carries meaning to it, whatever it might be, like the shape, the gesture of a particular plant. And I think this is where it's like there's interesting connections with certain indigenous traditions, or in Europe even, where there's the notion of the doctrine of signatures, like every plant is a kind of song and spirit and has a particular character to it, and other creatures as well.
Yeah, I mean, you referenced the indigenous worldviews, perceptions, imagination, and I think this is very timely because, again, I think Barfield can give us strong hints as to how to revisit those half lost, traditions that are being recovered. Um, because what he's saying is we should avoid the kind of nostalgic desire to somehow return or revert back to what he would call an original participation. But maybe there's even a meaning that can be discerned in the recovery that's not just about telling the story of injustice and colonization and so on, important though that is. But that's important because it becomes then liberative so that we can relearn what was in these traditions, but afresh for our now. Um, and so, how I mean, I think about this a lot in terms of how I read Dante, for example. That my reading of Dante is not to try and return to some sort of medieval worldview where the whole of nature was seen as a theophany, but is to use that old imaginary to imagine how that might be known now from the vantage of the 21st century. I think we've mentioned Blake quite a lot, and Blake too was very much onto that. We mentioned the imagination. He would say the imagination is not something that I have a little bit of, you have a little bit of, and if we're lucky, we have a kind of creative spirit and can make something of that. No, Blake's saying the imagination has us. The call is how we can co-create with that divine imagination. And I feel like what people are often reflecting on in thinking about indigeneity is how that can be carried into our experience now and not just remembered and reclaimed from the past.
Yeah, because I think that it ends up being anachronistic in a lot of ways. And but if there's this recognition that to be, I mean, people mean different things by it, but to have like a really holistic relationship with place and with just the earth in general, wherever you are, I think. And whereas, and I feel like that's kind of actually more consistently Christian or incarnational than what often I think gets rightly criticized, when Christianity's presented as just this world negating perspective that doesn't have any interest in exploring the manifold expression of divinity and its separative projecting throughout the various kingdoms of nature and the spirit world.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, this is a corrective, if not a rediscovery of a kind of pre-modern sensibility that undoubtedly has taken bad terms with Dominion theology, whatever, however it might be named. Although, again, one of the reasons I love Barfield is that he's always saying that although there's genuine tragedy, ultimately it is a comedy in the old sense that which was it seemed like a descent makes for a new kind of ascent, and the good tendency can always be reclaimed and rediscovered and realigned with, maybe that's a better way of putting it, in
Yeah.
spite of all that's happened.
Yes. Yeah. It does. It was it Tolkien that uses the phrase eucatastrophe? Yeah. Yeah. I love that word. And I think I, whenever I just reflect on the perspective which would consider this whole process as only being one of catastrophe or tragedy, just think of the value of what we experience today in our individuality and our ethics and politics that reflect that when they're good, like when they're really trying to measure up to those intuitions and to uphold them, is that I'm glad to be living in this time because, well, for instance, just because like it's so complicated. Like I feel like throughout the world and in different cultures, there have been different ways of negotiating this. But for instance, like I'm gay, and I think that part of, I guess, the way in which I can be allowed in certain parts of the world to just live out myself, my individuality, wouldn't have quite been an option for me like in the past, and that there would have been more of a kind of group determination of that. And but then I think that if I were to impose what I think is right for this time and in this experience of self 2000 years ago in a different context, it could be a kind of violence, to impose that perspective when someone, who we might describe as gay in this time, in this context, might have a very different way of understanding what that means, that is organized in accordance with the community. And so you can't really like displace how we understand things now into like the context of original participation, for example. So there's like a kind of both and to that, like there's some, it just kind of depends on where you're looking, right? And yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, I've thought about this a lot as well because I'm gay too, actually, and I think that part of what Christianity is wrestling with in its moral understanding of sexuality is precisely the impossibility of reading present experience back into texts that are 2,000 years old. And
Yes.
whatever it was that the New Testament was wrestling with in terms of what we would now call sexuality then is nothing like what it means now. I mean, I suspect that for St. Paul, for example, it was a notion of a new kind of freedom that was emerging, and he contrasted the old freedom of the Roman free man, which was particularly around what he did with his body and what he could do with other people's bodies, with the new freedom that was a freedom found in Christ. And so the contrast with the kind of old Roman freedom was almost a convenient illustration to illustrate how the new freedom in Christ wasn't based on your civic place, but was based upon your participation in Christ. Now, that's had the unfortunate consequence that when that original context gets forgotten, which was itself a kind of an evolution of an older participation, when that gets forgotten, it seems like it's saying something very different now. But I mean, I actually feel that part of my experience of myself now is that I don't know, when the world is divided again by political rhetoric. When people talk about men and women as if that's just two
Uh-huh.
distinct human groups that somehow are in sort of conflict. My position in that is not comfortable, but there's a there's a possibility of trying to stay in that tension and discomfort because you don't find yourself identifying with one side or the other, for a new kind of participation again. That makes for a sort of third possibility. At least, that's what I hope when you feel that kind of discomfort.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because I think, with all the debates today about gender and and this sort of like blaming of the sexual revolution for the ills of today, and this desire to bring back in a kind of anachronistic way old norms. I just think, and this is one of the reasons why I would end up not thinking that Christianity was actually that the prohibition, against homosexuality, for instance, in the history of Christianity isn't actually necessarily essential to it, because when you think like with Barfield and Steiner or anyone who envisions Christianity or that Christ is bound up with the evolutionary process, like there's there's no identical repetition, and there's like this, at least for them, this also emphasis, this increasing emphasis on the individual, and so that we can't really prescribe norms in the way that we used to. I think we should just let people live themselves out, as long as they're being just to others, and because every person is going to be unique, and yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
I would be, maybe, I hope not moralizing, but would say, but there's got to be a sense of meaning or purposiveness in that living
yeah,
out, which is to
yeah,
reach to that which isn't yet manifest or fully developed. So there's a transcendent impulse again in that. So it's very different from a pure sort of, I don't know, expressivism, or a pure pursuit of pleasure in a consumptive kind of way. We all make our mistakes, but
yeah,
nonetheless, behind through that might be felt, put it like this. I think Christianity is much better expressed as a kind of future orientated
hmm,
um, way of understanding life than one that is nostalgic, as if it's about the recovery of a past. And the debate about sexuality and gender is very evident here, because I think that the more conservative mindset is a tendency to look back. It maybe looks at the beginning of the Bible, Genesis, and talks about how there's a kind of created order there that somehow must be matched and mirrored now. But I would say no, the tendency in the Bible is towards the future, is towards the heavenly Jerusalem. And that then is about the receipt of something from the future. And so the turbulence and difficulty which we might feel now is precisely the way in which that future might be received through the mistakes and errors. But as you were saying earlier, that's why things like forgiveness are so important, so that we can be free to be drawn towards that future heavenly city, and not feel that the sum total of Christianity is a sort of reversion to some sort of Edenic past. And again, I think Barfield and others are really wonderful, because they're being absolutely serious to the Christ impulse, as you call it, but seeing that seriousness is precisely towards the realization of a new future, not the sort of desperate attempt to protect some sort of imagined past.
yes, yeah, and I totally agree. I mean, I think we really need models of, I guess, more with respect to sexuality, and how to orient toward pleasure, for a kind of, I guess, sacramental attitude about that. I guess I meant more like as far as like the expressivism, like more in relation to like gender and like people's, just the way they end up expressing themselves, like rather than having like kind of rigid ideas of how you should be a man or how you should be a woman or in between, whatever. That's kind of, I think, part of the problem, why there's so much confusion, is that there's such rigid ideas about those those poles, and that, um, yeah, if we just like, but then there's the danger as well of not merely being allowed to just like be oneself, but to become fixated with a kind of idol of oneself, or to have what should be, I guess, a kind of higher point of or reference point orienting us in our expression, for it to be kind of an idol. Yeah.
Look, there's another Barfieldian notion which you make use of, which is a very helpful one here, I think, for discerning new possibilities. And this is like his idea of residual unprocessed positivism, which he broadly can be summarized as saying that the moral matters to you, saying that the spirit matters to you, saying that consciousness matters to you, and yet secretly you're always putting matter at the heart of things. And so this might come about in a kind of body essentialism, as if what it means to be a man or a woman is defined ultimately by the body. Or in a different sphere, it might be saying, yeah, consciousness is clearly the realm in which we know ourselves to exist, and yet somehow it emerges from matter. And so matter has sort of been smuggled in again as the sort of fundamental stuff. And I think this notion of RUP again takes a bit of getting used to, but
Uh-huh.
asking yourself, in a way, it's Barfield's asking us to say, what's really doing the work here? Are we actually resorting to a kind of materialism when we have these moral arguments? When we think about, in debates about AI, are we using a notion of transhumanism that is essentially the extension of our material existence, say in terms of longevity? Or are we actually, transhumanism comes from Dante, and Dante, I think, meant the true sense of transhumanism, which is discovering the divinity within our humanity so that our humanity can be let go of in its mortal sense to discover the immortal, which is when he uses the words on the cusp of the paradise. So yeah, but Barfield's notion of RUP, residual unprocessed positivism, is, I think, very apposite in a lot of these debates today.
Yes. Yeah. And I think of it as like a nice little tool, or shorthand for, yeah, just analyzing, as you referenced, various cultural debates. And with respect to technology and transhumanism, I agree. I think that one of the things that I mentioned in my dissertation is that there's an intuition, um, among transhumanists, and a kind of reliance upon some notion of transcendence, and that's, even we could say, what constitutes our capacity to creatively, and the aspiration to direct evolution, and in a in in a way that other creatures can't. But there is this, yeah, to the extent that there's a presupposing that material existence is all there is, it's ultimately misguided, because, as you say, and I love that. Um, I was really glad to discover you drawing that connection in your video on Dante and transhumanism, that's where the word originates. I just think it's so cool because, as you suggest, really the genuine transhumanism is a reflection of our being lured toward that New Jerusalem vision, and that yeah, there's a kind of lifting up of the fallen state, which I think Barfield envisions with Steiner, like literally, but like very far, whatever even those relative time markers mean in their cosmology. But yeah.
Look, you we've been skirting around Steiner a bit, and but Steiner is a big part of the work that you've done, and raises this question of how to understand Steiner, and then how to understand Barfield, when Barfield regularly makes these comments about, you won't understand what I'm talking about unless you've really got to grips with Steiner as well.
Yeah.
But I mean, one of the things which I found your work helpful in, actually, is that you try and discern things in Steiner. It is tricky in Steiner when the anthroposophist loyalty to Steiner um, is very inclined to say we must take Steiner at his word. And as you say, whatever he means, he must mean something literally here um, when he talks about these future unfoldings and indeed, the past unfoldings as well. But one of the ways you do that is you go to the difficult parts of Steiner too, and because he does make comments which clearly are racist,
Hmm.
and so how to receive those comments and situate them alongside the more inspiring comments requires us to do some work again, and maybe that's what Steiner would want. He wouldn't want us just to take him at his word as if we're the sort of robot receivers of that, being programmed by him in some way. But this is all an invitation to co-creativity, and so having a critical stance towards Steiner would be another way of putting it, which your work is fostering.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope so. I think, I first encountered Steiner when I started this program, and I was very interested because if anyone's familiar with Waldorf education, like it's just, I mean, Steiner understood this himself. It's really a kind of continuation of German idealism and like Schiller's ideas and on the aesthetic education of the human. It's a kind of holistic vision, and that like a vision that wants to reintegrate all the disciplines and make them existentially relevant or salient, and also this kind of positive vision of humanity as an essential member in creation, and has this really inspiring vocation. But then I was also, because my school's in San Francisco, and so I was also very aware of like other people's attitudes towards him because of these, the unfortunate like racist remarks he made. And so, yeah, I've had, yeah, just an ambivalent relationship to it. But yeah, being and then getting into Barfield and seeing him now and then be like, well, you gotta take a look at Steiner. It's nice to be able. It's kind of liberating to be able to uh, work with. uh, There's just so much that Steiner gave, but without feeling like you need to, because he said so much about pretty much like anything you could think of, except for he didn't say much about sexuality. but um, but it can be so easy because of that to just totally fall within that worldview and not question it, and not question Steiner, because if you question Steiner and he's not perfect, then it sort of threatens the whole cosmology, and it is very meaningful. It provides a lot of orientation, but yeah, I think it's just, yeah, it's an exciting prospect to be able to work with it, because I think it has, in a way, at least for academics, been something nobody wanted to really touch, um, and also to be critical of it. And that, like you said, I think he said, even though he does maybe the sort of attitude the confidence with which he pronounces certain spiritual facts like might lead you to think otherwise, he definitely time and time again was like, I want y'all to like achieve these capacities and take up this work and confirm what I'm saying for yourself, or not, or make good upon it, or revise or whatever. So
But it's
yeah,
got to be
I
this. Sorry,
go ahead.
yeah. I was
You
just
go
going to
ahead.
say, but it's to do that has got to be again this bringing together of the individual and the shared. You
Yes.
can't just lose your sense of self to a kind of collective wisdom. That precisely is not what the invitation is.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And there's going to be a conference at Harvard on Steiner in like honor of 100 years since his passing. So it seems like there's more interest. So that's exciting. I look forward to hearing what other people like working with it in a scholarly way will have to say.
That will be interesting. I'll be interested to see how that
You
unfolds.
should go.
Um, yeah. I mean, Barfield for me, is, although I can feel intimidated by his references to Steiner, he is still, he's so helpful because I think that the way that he gained the intuitions that he then found affirmed in Steiner is very accessible actually, because through the philology, through the history of language, and how words are these fossils of consciousness, and you can see how a consciousness emerges and shifts and change over the 3,000 odd years of recorded written language that we have, that's sort of the fundamental sense that is so important now. That we've been raging over quite a number of different areas, but which has been really good because this is why Barfield matters. I don't know whether you feel there's anything else that you want to touch on if we did begin to draw to a close, or whether
I
we've
think,
touched on quite a lot.
yeah, I feel like we touched on a lot, and I feel complete. And I'd love to have another conversation sometime. This was really great and generative. Yeah,
Yeah, well, look, thank you again for the work you're doing, and it's great that the more of us that are kind of interested in Barfield and trying to pick up the baton that he's handed to us and work out what this means for now. And um, I believe that someone somewhere, whether it was Lewis or Barfield, talked about how Lewis's time had already come, but Barfield's might come in about 50 years, and maybe we're hitting that moment now. It certainly feels that a lot of the tensions that can so easily get split um, will be helped so much by this more polar or triangulating or Coleridgean understanding of things that Barfield took up, and then gives so clearly this Christic impulse that there's always this rising within the immanent towards the transcendent. So I hope that's the dynamic. But thanks so much, Ashton.
likewise. Yeah, amen. I think as it feels like we are kind of reaching more crescendos in the world, and so I do think something like this would be just such a vital way to help us through into creative new possibilities. So anyway, thanks so much.
Thank you.